polls in the U.S. in 15 states and 1 territory, and for what are known as Super Tuesday primaries. It appears U.S. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump are poised for a rematch of the 2020 elections. VOA correspondent Chris Casquejo joins us live in Northern Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., with more. Good morning, Chris. Thank you for joining us once again on PTV News Tonight.
Good morning from rainy Northern Virginia.
All right, let's get down to it. Why is Super Tuesday, Chris, so important in the nominating process for the 2 major U.S. parties?
Well, Super Tuesday is important because 1/3 of all the delegates that are needed to capture the respective parties' nominations are at stake here on Super Tuesday in these 15 states and American Samoa. This is part of the nominating process. As you may know, each state makes its own rules for primaries. For example, some have what are known as open primaries, in which voters can choose a Republican or Democratic ballot regardless of their own party affiliation. Other states have closed primaries in which voting is limited to those who declare their party affiliation to be Democratic or Republican. Charms?
Great. Polls now suggest that former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley is significantly trailing former President Donald Trump in the state's voting Super Tuesday primaries. Is she expected to drop out of the race after today?
Well, it's really up to her own personal opinion, whether she wants to stay in the race or not, and whether her financial backers, her big donors, are going to keep her in the race, even though it looks like she is not going to win a majority of delegates in these nominating contests. She did have a victory Sunday in the D.C. primary, but there's only a handful of delegates at stake in the D.C. primary, and only 2,000 people voted in that primary because D.C. is majority Democratic. But here's the challenge for Haley as it stands here on Super Tuesday. States with the largest number of delegates, like California and Texas, have those closed primaries, meaning only registered Republican voters can cast ballots. Haley has been drawing much of her support from independents and moderates and Democrats who've crossed over to vote in open primaries. So you can see the challenge that lies ahead for her here on Super Tuesday.
Okay, so my follow-up question for you, Chris, based on your answer is, do you now think that she might consider a third-party no-labels run, given her belief that perhaps 70% of the electorate do not want a Biden and Trump rematch in November?
You know, she hasn't signaled that she would run as a third-party candidate, but she has backed off from her pledge to support Trump if he is the eventual nominee. She made those comments over the weekend on NBC News, saying that she agreed to that because she wanted to get on the ballot, but she's really backed off on that, and it seems that it's uncertain whether she will support the nominee. Now, whether she goes ahead to run as a third-party candidate, it remains to be seen. But, we'll have to see whether she stays in the race or whether she drops out.
All right. Regarding the U.S. Supreme Court victory, the legal victory that was handed to Trump Monday so that he'll be able to stay on the ballot in states that tried to rule that he was ineligible based on his role on the January 6th Capitol riot. Can you tell us more about this and its further implications?
Yes, the U.S. Supreme Court justices unanimously reversed a December 19th decision by Colorado's Supreme Court that threw Trump off the Republican primary ballot in that state due to a clause in the 14th Amendment which says that any political official or elected official is not eligible to run because if they participated in insurrection. But the Supreme Court ruled that states have no right to make such rulings, and that also threw out similar measures in Illinois and Maine. Trump's eligibility had been challenged in court by 6 voters in Colorado, 4 Republicans and 2 independents, who portrayed him as a threat to American democracy and sought to hold him accountable for his role in the January 6th Capitol riots. But the Supreme Court is not done with former President Donald Trump. They're expected to rule in a few weeks on his case where he claims that he has total immunity for any actions that he took while he was in the office of president.
Chris, current President Biden is running virtually unopposed. Should we expect any surprises on the Democratic side for Super Tuesday?
Observers are going to be watching whether Democrats are going to vote uncommitted or undeclared in states that allow such a thing. Michigan's primary effort, this protest effort in Michigan, drew more than 100,000 votes, which was 13% of the vote in that Democratic primary. Now, Michigan has a significant Arab American population in the Detroit suburb of Dearborn, and a lot of the voters there are angry over Biden's handling of the Israel-Hamas war, not calling for a ceasefire until Vice President Kamala Harris called for one just earlier this week, and also not sending aid until the aid drops this week as well. There's a similar effort underway in the state of Minnesota, just a couple of states away from Michigan, Minnesota has a significant Somali American population that is predominantly Muslim and may launch a similar protest vote against Biden's policies towards Israel and against his handling of U.S. policy toward Israel regarding the Israel-Hamas war. Charms?
Yeah, Chris, immigration and the economy are now two of the biggest issues based on the last few polls, pretty much similar or identical to what the voters said in the last midterm elections. But the red wave that many predicted never quite took off or turned out because the state of democracy was also paramount among voters. Do you think democracy is also on the table this coming November? And do you think Trump will lead another attack on democracy?
Well, that's how the Democrats want to frame it. They have said that Trump is out for vengeance in his next term. He's promising to prosecute Biden and shut down any investigations that are ongoing against him by what he calls Biden's weaponized Justice Department. And the Democrats really do want to make this race about democracy and abortion rights, whereas Republicans want to make this race about the economy and the border, which is why you saw both of the candidates at separate spots along the Texas-Mexico border last week.
The 2020 U.S. presidential elections yielded a massive turnout of over 155 million voters in a bitterly contested face-off that Trump and his followers to this day refuse to accept. Now, it has become increasingly apparent a rematch is in order, all set. One that, as I mentioned earlier, 70% of Americans may be askew or loath. Now, in your heart of hearts, Chris, do you think that a low or substantially diminished turnout is in store in November?
Well, it just depends. I mean, primaries don't have as much turnout as general elections, so we're not seeing that many people here today, perhaps because of the weather, perhaps because Arlington, Virginia, where we are, is predominantly Democratic and Joe Biden is virtually running uncontested. But, we'll have to see how the turnout is, as the summer goes on. I mean, a lot can happen. November is a long time away.
Speaking of November, if the U.S. presidential elections were held today or on Super Tuesday, who do you think would have the edge, given the overall mood of the electorate right now?
Well, the electorate is so polarized here in the U.S. Each side is framing this election as a fight for America's future. Republicans say that there are crime-infested cities, major cities, and they say that there's open borders and lawlessness and terrorists are coming into the U.S.-Mexico border. Whereas, the Democratic side and Joe Biden and key Democrats are saying that Donald Trump should not be reelected in this office because he is a unique threat to American democracy and that he will, not follow the Constitution. And Nikki Haley even took him to task for that, for saying, she says that she doesn't know whether he would follow the Constitution if he were elected again. So, we'll just have to see what happens. Each side, it's going to be about turnout. Which side can turn out most of its voters? Because the reality is, according to the polls, there are very few persuadable voters out there. So it's really going to come down to those independent voters, those moderates, and the voters in those key swing states like Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, like it was the last time around.
Well, a lot can happen in 8 months. Thank you so much, Chris Casquejo, for sharing your thoughts, opinions, and observations. Looking forward to having you again here on the show next time. Thank you.